Good morning. Will you guys go ahead and take a Bible and turn to Joshua 24? You can find that on page 189 if you're using one of our Bibles this morning. Today we're in part 4 of a series that we've been calling Stranger Than Fiction. We've been thinking about some of the most shocking scenes in all of the Bible, and particularly in the Bible book of Judges. And we've each week looked at an individual shocking story, a shocking and even graphic story at times. Today we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to take a step back and widen our lens, and we're going to look at the overarching story of the people of Israel. And what we're going to see today, in some ways, it's not quite as shocking as the stories we've looked at so far. And yet, I think what we're going to discover, it really should be shocking to us. And I really think it would be shocking to us if only it weren't so common in our own lives. But before we jump into today's passage, I want to take just a moment to say hello to all my friends out at our Greece campus, at our Webster campus, those joining us online. Good to have you with us. As we've moved around in the book of Judges, we've noticed, as we've looked at what's gone on there, that we can be affected. We've noticed what can happen when and what the effect of the situation in our lives is when we choose to make our own personal standard the ultimate standard, sort of what we might call the underbelly of the American dream, that I could just live, if I could just live the way I want, doing what I want, when I want, with whom I want, then we feel like, then I'd be finally free. If I could just live with unrestricted choices, then that would be like amazing freedom. That's how we feel, yet what we've seen time and again in the book of Judges is that if we choose to live that way, it always comes with some fine print attached. And the fine print is simply this: as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. Don't we hear that today? I can do whatever I want to do, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. But what we've seen again and again in Judges, and what we saw particularly in week 1 of this series, is that there's simply no way to live doing what I want, when I want, with whom I want, without eventually hurting someone. We always hurt someone along the way. We always hurt ourselves in the process, and we're a somebody, you know. We hurt those that we're with. We hurt those that are, that love us, those that are coming after us. And we all know this experientially, don't we? I mean, when we were teenagers, we probably made some pretty stupid choices. But people were quick to forgive us. They said, oh, he's young, she's young. But still, there were some kind of low-grade consequences. We tore up some relationships. We annoyed some people along the way. But then as we got a little bit older, we noticed that the consequences began to get more real. The price that we now paid was higher when we decided to sleep in and skip class or show up late for work because, though mom was always okay with it, the employer, the professors, they don't seem as eager to forgive. And when I was young, when I was a teenager and I misbehaved, I got a slap on the wrist, but now I feel the slap of the handcuffs on my wrist because the reckless patterns that I established when I was young, they're not quite as funny to people anymore. See, there's simply no way to live only for ourselves, doing what we want, when we want, with whom we want, without hurting someone along the way. And if we're not careful, one day we wake up in our mid-30s and mid-40s and we look back and we see an entire wake of ravaged relationships and broken people. And we ourselves are hurting immensely from the pain of remorse and regret. This is really nothing new. Even the ancient people of Israel, even a nation that was started through divine intervention, even a nation that was meant to be a theocracy, perfectly ruled over by God himself, even they weren't immune from this reality. We've seen it, haven't we, all throughout this series, this Judges cycle, where Israel would disobey God. There'd be disobedience, and it was always followed by some form of disaster, perhaps captivity to an enemy nation. But then God in his mercy would raise up a judge, a leader, and he would rescue them, and there'd be deliverance. This cycle, and we see it time and again through the book of Judges. And when we finally get to the end of the book, we're hopeful that maybe there's been a lesson learned, but what we see there is not encouraging. It's downright frightening, in fact. We looked at it in week 1 of this series, the very final scenes of the book, kind of like a scene right out of, Saw 6 meets Friday the 13th or something. Just downright horrible stuff. And we finally see the very last words of this book, Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Israel had, in fact, done what they wanted, when they wanted, with whom they wanted, but it had only led them into great misery. But I want you to know this morning that that is not how it all began. No, that's not how it all began at all. In fact, Roman numeral number 1 on your notes this morning, Israel set out to be seriously committed to the Lord. This period in Israel's history, it didn't begin like a scene right out of a horror flick. No, quite the opposite, in fact. This period in Israel's history began more like a scene right out of the last night of church camp. Now, I don't know if you're familiar or not with church camp, but I sure am. To me, church camp, summer church camp, was like the pinnacle experience of my childhood and adolescence. You see, for 1 week every year, being a Christian was actually fun. You see, you have to understand that the church I grew up in was ultra boring. Or at least that was my perception of it as a boy. And as I got to be a teenager, things didn't really improve that much. You see, we didn't have at our church an awesome youth ministry like we have here at Northridge Church. In fact, at my church, we didn't have a youth ministry at all. Once in a while, my own parents would gather up the handful of teenagers that attended my church together, and we'd have some sort of an activity. And as cool as that was to, have my own parents there, well, church camp was this altogether different thing. It was this opportunity to get away and experience fun and friendships and adventure. It was this amazing, amazing thing. But what I quickly discovered that it was all really just a setup. It was a setup to corral all of us as campers into the chapel services, where we'd be challenged about the way we were living our wayward lives. Right? And as the week progressed, we'd become more emotionally and spiritually engaged. And then the culmination of this sort of spiritual frenzy was the Friday night campfire, the Friday night bonfire, the last night of camp, where all of us as campers would have the opportunity to speak into the microphone and declare the decision that we had made to fully surrender our life to the Lord. I remember there was over-emotional girl. She'd step up to the microphone and she'd say something like this: "Well, before camp, I was dating a guy who was no good for me. And when I get home from camp, well, I'm going to break up with him." And the whole crowd, all the camp would just applaud and cheer the girl. Was so happy for her. And then after, she left the microphone, death metal guy would come up to the microphone and he'd say like, before camp, I was listening to a bunch of music that was just tearing me down. But when I get home from camp, I'm burning all my tapes. Which, this was the 80s, okay? So cassette tapes. And, the crowd again would clap and cheer, so happy for this guy. And then again, another would come up to the microphone. "When I get home from camp, I'm going to toss out all my cigarettes. I'm going to quit smoking." And everybody, at that point, the crowd would just erupt because that was a really big one, you know what I mean? And one after another, we as campers would have this opportunity to experience just this ultimate spiritual high, this mountaintop experience. And I think at some point in Israel's history, just before their leader Joshua was about to die, they have this sort of final night of church camp moment together. I've asked you to go to Joshua 24, and we notice down in verse 14, Joshua's words to the people. So he gathers them around and he says this in verse 14: "Now, fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt. Throw away those gods, break up with that guy that's no good for you. Toss out those cigarettes, burn all your tapes." He says, "and serve the Lord." Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord and serve other gods." In other words, Joshua will never, ever, ever sin ever again. And they continue in verse 17. "It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes." And then at the end of verse 18, they declare, "We too will serve the Lord because he is our God." Joshua, he's not just our parents' God, he's our God. Now that sounds pretty good. That sounds pretty promising, doesn't it? They were seriously committed to serving the Lord. But notice what happens next. In verse 19, Joshua kind of taunts them a little bit. He says this, Joshua said to the people, "You are not able to serve the Lord." In other words, he's saying, I don't think you can do it. He's a little bit cynical, a little bit skeptical. He's saying, hey, aren't you the kid that came up to the microphone at camp last year and you bawled your eyes out and you spilled your guts, and now here you are again this year admitting that you crashed and burned? Why should we believe you? But, verse 21, but the people said to Joshua, "No, we will serve the Lord." No, Joshua, this time things are gonna be different. That's right. This time, Joshua, things are gonna be different. And then the very next day, all the parents came up to camp and everybody loaded up into all the vehicles and they all went home. And for a little while, things actually were different. But only for a very little while, because it didn't take long before they quickly fell into old patterns and old habits once again. And we only need to get two chapters deep into the book of Judges before we read these sobering words. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. Baal, the Baals, the Ashtoreths. These were common fertility gods of the Canaanite peoples that surrounded them, worship of which included ritual prostitution and even child sacrifice at times. In other words, when Israel fell, they fell hard. And I've noticed this truth about spiritual mountaintop experiences in our own lives. If we're not careful, they can quickly be followed by some deep spiritual lows. And that's what happened to Israel. In verse 14, we see God's response. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. And then verse 15 ends with this hopeless phrase, they were in great distress. Yeah, of course, they were. They were in great distress. And I think in this unfolding drama that we see here with the people of Israel, we can see, and hopefully we can learn some vital lessons for our own lives. Because while it's true that Israel was seriously committed to the Lord, it actually didn't take too long before, Roman numeral number 2 on your notes, Israel simply traded one king for another. It didn't take long before Israel simply traded one king for another. In their effort to get out from under authority, the shocking irony is they simply found themselves under a new authority. It's as if God was saying, you no longer want to live within my loving authority? Fine, then you can experience a new authority, a different kind of authority that you're not going to enjoy very much. Israel had, in fact, done as they saw fit, but it didn't lead them to the place of great freedom they expected it to. Instead, it led them down a very predictable path. It was a path that started with letter A, they forsook the Lord. This path started with an attitude that said, I'll do what I want to do, and nobody can tell me any differently. I'll watch that. I'll listen to that. I'll click on that. I'll date that unbeliever. I'll sleep with my boyfriend or girlfriend. I'll use that. I'll do what I want to do, and nobody can tell me any differently. That attitude quickly led them to step B, letter B. They followed the people around them. They simply began doing what everyone in the culture was doing. In all my years as a youth pastor, I was often amused at just how often in a teenager's attempt to be original, how often they simply copied the patterns and behaviors of their friends, of those around them. But it's not only teenagers. We as adults, we also do this. We may hide it just a little bit better. Israel did this as well. And in the void that was created in their lives when they abandoned God's way, they quickly filled that void with a substitute. It led to step C. They lost the freedom that they thought they were gaining. You see, they were no longer able to choose. The passage says they were no longer able to resist. They actually felt overwhelmed and powerless against these new dictators until finally, letter D, they in the end were governed by another king. In the end, they truly had no freedom at all. They were captives. And maybe this predictable path sounds familiar to you. I know it does to me, and I think it highlights for us maybe the most important principle that you and I need to recognize this morning, and it's simply this, that when you say no to God, you always trade one king for another. When you choose to say no to God, you're just trading one king for another. It's not as if you're getting out from under authority. You're simply choosing another authority. When you resist God's loving authority, you essentially just place yourself in submission to smaller, compassionless kings. You see, God, our true king, he has created a moral framework in which we are to live our lives. It's a good way that he's created. And when you and I choose to abandon his way, we always do so at our own peril, because at the very moment that we leave his good way, we immediately step into another little kingdom ruled over by a merciless little substitute king. I think it plays out this way in our lives. I think we see that God has a kingdom. We see it there. And we notice something about that. Well, we hear about God's kingdom, right? We hear it preached about. We hear it taught about on Sunday mornings. We read about it in the Bible. And we notice something about God's kingdom, that it has some borders around it. And we think to ourselves, man, if I could just get outside those borders, then I'd really know the life. Then I'd really be free. We think that freedom is found somehow out there. But what we quickly discover is that the moment we take one step outside of God's kingdom, we immediately find ourselves in another little kingdom ruled over by little kings. Little kingdom ruled over by little merciful kings. Who are these kings? Well, they're the kings of greed and consumption, the kings of insecurity and appetite and fear and pride and family history and comparison and lust. And there are many others. Maybe some of those sound like familiar kings to you. And what we tend to think is this. We tend to think, you know what? There must be a lot of space between the border of God's kingdom and the border of these other little kingdoms. I mean, I know I'm not exactly serving God right now, we might say to ourselves, but it's not like I'm trapped in the kingdom of lust. It's not like I'm trapped in the kingdom of greed. But here's what we don't recognize. The reality is that the moment we step outside of God's kingdom, we step right into another little kingdom. There's no space at all. And you might be tempted to argue against that this morning. You might be tempted to say, well, you know what, that may be true for some people, but that's not the case with me. You see, I make my own decisions. Nobody tells me what to do. I'm my own person. I'm my own king. But I hope you'll realize that if that's your attitude, then the reality is you may, in fact, have already fallen prey to the most classic little king of all, the little king of self. And I want you to know that he is a most cruel dictator. She is a most cruel tyrant. I think that Paul recognizes this reality in the New Testament as well, and when he describes people who are enemies of the cross of Jesus in Philippians 3:19, he says this: their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, their little king is their stomach, their appetite. It's not as if they have no God, they do. It's just a little king, a little God. He says their glory is in their shame and their mind is set on earthly things. So even though these little kings may go by different names, I think that they have some common traits among them. Let me list for you this morning 3 characteristics of little kings. The first one is this: little kings always take us from I won't to I can't. Please understand that little kings, they always take us from I won't to I can't. They initially tempt us to declare, God, I won't. I won't do it. I won't give that up. I won't give him up. I won't give her up. I won't live constrained by what God says is healthy sexually. I won't wear clothes that are modest. I won't filter what I watch or what I listen to. God, I'm just not willing to. I won't do it. But little kings always take us from I won't to a place where we find ourselves inevitably crying out to God, God, I can't do it. I can't give this up. I can't give up that substance. I can't break that habit. God, I can't keep away from him. I can't keep away from her. I can't keep myself from clicking on that. God, I want to, but I just can't do it. Little kings always take us from I won't to I can't. I love how Andy Stanley expresses this when he says it this way: it is always easier to say no to God than it is to say no to the things you substitute for God. Isn't that true? He goes on to say this, it's so much easier to say no to God and yes to that destructive relationship than it is to say no to that relationship and yes to God. It's much easier to say no to God and yes to that thing that's become a habit than it is to say no to that habit and yes to God. You see, the truth is that you and I, we were never designed, we were never made to rule over our own lives. And as soon as we try to do that, we'll find ourselves at the mercy of these little kings that rule over the kingdom of I can't. I wonder today, what is the I can't kingdom that you might be presently living in? Is it, man, I can't quit using that substance. I can't keep from looking at porn. I can't treat my wife with respect. I can't treat my husband with respect. I can't seem to stay honest in the things I say. I can't stop myself from lying. I can't control my anger. I can't control the things I say. I can't stop losing it with my kids. I can't obey my parents. I can't. Little kings always take us from I won't to I can't. In the next several verses, we see the judges cycle that we've looked at all throughout this series explained, where Israel would be freed from captivity through a judge, a leader that God would raise up, and then quickly they'd fall into sinful patterns once again, only to cry out to God and then once again be raised out of captivity again through a judge. But then verse 19 explains this, but when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors. Following other gods and serving and worshiping them, they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. The second characteristic of little kings is this: little kings are never satisfied. They're never satisfied. I want you to notice the ever-increasing severity to the depth of Israel's sinfulness. They return to their old ways, but not just to their old ways. They return to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, and that's the way that these little kings operate. Their tax hikes are unreasonable. I guess they're kind of like the state of New York. You know what I mean? They keep demanding more and more from you. What was once a few quick outbursts of anger has now become continuous rage. What was once a few quick sheepish peeks at an inappropriate image is now a full-blown porn addiction. What was once a little overindulgence with food has now become outright gluttony. What was once a few dollars spent on a fun sports wager has now become a gambling addiction. Little kings always take us from I won't to I can't, and they're never satisfied. They always demand more and more from us. And there's one other characteristic that I think is worth noting of these little kings. Little kings are liars. They're liars. They promise life, but take it. They offer pleasure, but in the end produce only pain. They promise freedom, but they imprison. Little kings always overpromise and severely underdeliver. You know, I can imagine that when Israel first stepped out of God's good boundaries, I imagine when they first abandoned His ways, man, they must have been so excited. They must have been like, man, this is going to be great. This is so exciting. We're going to have the freedoms that we never enjoyed. We're going to have life like we always imagined it to be. And that is the deception of little kings. There always is a little bit of pleasure for a very short while, but the price that we'll pay for that pleasure is unreasonable and never worth the short pleasure. And so we finally see where Israel landed. Chapter 3, verse 8 says this: the anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that He sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. That's a mouthful. Right? To whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years, 8 long years. It's as if God was saying to them, you don't want to serve me as your king any longer? Fine, then you can serve that guy. You know, at least you can pronounce my name, right? Yahweh, pretty simple. But here we see that Israel had finally arrived. They had done what they wanted, when they wanted, with whom they wanted, and now they were reaping the harvest of those choices. And I think it's so important for you and I today that we recognize that when we're tempted to abandon God's ways and to follow after that temptation, that promise of freedom, that we'll quickly recognize that we'd only really be trading one king for another, and that those other little kings would not be merciful and they would not be forgiving. In fact, they'd be little tyrants. See, true freedom exists within the framework of God's loving authority. That's where true freedom really exists for us. True freedom exists in placing ourselves under the authority of the God that created us. He knows us best. He knows what we need, and He knows what we need to stay away from. Don't be mistaken about where true freedom is really found. So then this morning, what should our response be? What should we do in response to this truth? Well, I think a couple challenges that I want to issue you today. First of all, I want to challenge you to see through the offer the little kings make. See right through the offer that these little kings are making you. Would you be wise enough this morning to see right through the offer that these little kings make and notice the predictable path that it actually is and where that path would take you if you chose to take the bait? Notice the captivity that's found there, the enslavement that's found there, and then choose instead to make a better choice. Be the wise person that says, no, I'm going to choose to live within the loving authority that God has provided me, because that is where true, enjoyable freedom is found. That is where life was meant to be lived. Another challenge this morning is this. I want you to go beyond serious commitment to next steps. You see, I think we need to understand that serious commitment alone is simply not enough. Israel was seriously committed to the Lord. The problem is they weren't rightly directed, and that was their undoing. Here at Northridge Church, we talk all the time around here about next steps. If you've been with us for very long at all, you'll know that we talk about taking next steps. We celebrate when we see a person taking a next step, and that's simply because we believe that every next step toward Jesus is a step of surrender to our true King. I want to say this to you this morning. I don't know exactly, if you're a follower of Jesus, I don't know exactly what your next step needs to be, but I know this, you need to take one. All of us need to be identifying a next step that we could take and we should take on our spiritual journey. And no matter how old you are, no matter how long you've been a follower of Jesus, each of us should take a next step. If you're 8 years old or 80 years old, you should take a next step. So what will your next step be? Maybe it's to join a community group. We talk a lot about that around here. We really believe that every Christian should be in a small group of other believers that can encourage and challenge them along life's path. If you're not in a community group, we've got a brand new start of community groups happening in 2 weeks. I hope you'll plug into a community group. Maybe that's your next step. Maybe it's the step of being baptized. You've not followed Christ in obedience that way. You've been a follower of Jesus, but you haven't yet been baptized. Would you take that next step of declaring your faith in Christ publicly and allowing your story to impact others? Perhaps that's your next step today. Maybe it's to confess some sin that you've long harbored in your heart. Maybe it's to forgive a person that you've long resisted forgiving. Perhaps that's your next step. Perhaps it's to start a Bible reading plan. Maybe it's to start a pattern of prayer. Maybe it's to jump in here at Northridge Church and serve somewhere. God's gifted you. He's given you abilities in certain areas, and you could be a blessing to the body of Christ. Maybe that's your next step. I don't know what it is. I just know you need to be identifying one and then moving toward it, taking that step. If you're encouraged today to take a next step, I'd love for you to take today's connections card. It's at the bottom of your program, and there are some next steps listed there. If one of them interests you, check that box, and someone will follow up with you this week and give you more information if you drop that in the offering bucket that comes by in a bit. If there's not one on there that you think is of interest to you, you could write one in. That's great too. But be taking next steps. Let me talk to you for a moment this morning. If you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, you've come, and I want you to know we're so glad you're here. We hope that you've been so welcomed and you've felt warmly received. Quite honestly, it might be a weird experience for you. We hope it's been okay. But what I want you to know is that you too have a next step, and your next step is actually your first step. And it's to come to recognize that there's a God that made you, loves you, and wants to know you. And He wants you to know Him. And there'd be no greater joy today that we would have than to introduce you to your true King, the God that loves you. If we could be of any help that way, please let us know. I would also encourage you to talk to the person that invited you to come today. They would love to share with you more about what that would look like to have a personal relationship with God. For many others this morning, perhaps you can resonate with Israel. Perhaps you can look at your life and you could say, you know what? There was a time that I can point back to where I was seriously committed to the Lord. But along life's path, something happened. I lost my focus. I lost my passion. I was hurt somewhere along the way by an individual, maybe by a church experience. And as a result, you feel jaded. And you're now finding yourself in a far country serving a different king. I want you to know today that if that's where you're at, then though the book of Judges doesn't end hopefully, there's great hope for you. Because I want you to know that your true King God is abundantly merciful and abundantly loving. And when you get to the place in your life where you finally have had enough with little kings, when you get to the place where you're saying to yourself, man, I've served the king of self long enough. I've served the king of fear, the king of pride, the king of greed, the king of lust. They've been dominating my life for far too long, and they're destroying me. Guys, when you get to that spot, I want you to know that your true King God is abundantly merciful, and he's ready to rescue you. He's standing there with arms wide open, ready to welcome you back. And I would say this morning that that may just be the most shocking story in the entire Bible. Yes, it's a tale stranger than fiction that a perfect God would love flawed creatures like ourselves, but it's true. He does. He loves you, and he wants you to come to know him more and more and know his good way. Don't be deceived this morning. When you say no to God, you always trade one king for another. And because God knows the havoc, the turmoil, the devastation that those little kings would wreak on your life, he demands nothing but full surrender, because anything else would simply lead you back to serving lesser kings. By God's grace today, may we see right through the lies that these little kings are offering us, and may we be those that continually take those next steps in our faith development toward Jesus. Will you pray with me today? Lord God, I'm so grateful that you are not like those other kings. You are an altogether loving, forgiving, and merciful God. Lord, I'm so grateful today that your commands are not burdensome. That when we come to you, God, you love us so much, you pour your love out on us so much that we delight in obeying you. So God, would you this week and the days to come, would you give us a heart of obedience so that we would make those choices that are not only glorifying to you, but they're also best to our own lives. God, be pleased with everything that you see from us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.